So let me tell you about Fred Joseph if you don't know about him already. He is a New York Times best-selling author. This is the part where I, make embarrass the guests a little bit, but we have to celebrate his work. So Fred is a New York Times best-selling author of the book. You can tell I worked in book publicity at some point in my life, The Black Friend. He's a Forbes under 30 list maker for marketing and advertising. And he's an activist, as you all know, a philanthropist with over 10 years of marketing experience. And I can go on and on with his accomplishments. I just want to highlight a couple amazing things that he's done in the past couple of years. He is the sole creator of the largest GoFundMe campaign and just in history. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. It was the hashtag Black Panther Challenge. And he can talk to you a little more about that. He's also the creator of, that wasn't enough for him because he also is he's the largest individual COVID-19. He's the creator of the largest individual COVID-19 support effort, the Rent Relief Campaign. He raised over $2 million. And the list goes on and on. And I'm sure you've seen his writing in everywhere from the Huffington Post, USA Today, The Root, Adweek. But let's get into it. So I have a couple questions for Fred. Start writing your questions now and don't feel like you're being obnoxious if you keep repeating your questions because I'm noticing the chat is going crazy already. So I want to make sure we get to your questions. I want to make sure we get to your points. I know there's a lot of people in the room tonight who live in those very states that are banning the teaching of quote unquote critical race theory, which we'll talk about right now. So before we talk about critical race theory and what that is and why it's become such a big issue everywhere in America, I want to start by just talking about your book, The Black Friend. I won't hold it up again because it's getting a little obnoxious, right? So tell us what inspired you to write it, Fred, and also what you want your readers to walk away with after reading it.
Yeah. So first and foremost, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to see so many people on like you said, what is it, a Wednesday night? It's really sunny out. I just came from walking my very loud dog, so thank all of you for joining us, and I'm happy that we have an intimate setting because I like they both said as soon as we started. I want to hear from everybody on here. I want there to be a ton of questions. I want us to have dialogue. It's very rare that I get to be in such an intimate space. What drove me to write The Black Friend was frankly personal experience, right? Like obviously the book is filled with my personal experiences, but there was one specific experience for me, one morning rather, that kind of told me I needed to write the book. Very quickly, I was heading to the office. I got on the subway. I was listening to Marvin Gaye that morning, minding my business, feeling really good. It was like one of those mornings that I was like, you know those mornings where you're just like, oh, everything's gonna be great today, right? There was a seat on the subway, sat in my seat. As soon as I sat down, this young white woman next to me, she clutched her purse and like pulled it like close to her person. And as soon as she did it, obviously, I'm someone who's experienced microaggressions before, but for some reason, it was such a polarizing moment because of the morning that I was having. It was so good that I'm like, oh, I can't escape it, right? I can't escape microaggressions and the manifestations of racism, so on and so forth. So I went on Twitter and, I was very quick with my Twitter fingers, like, oh, I'm so angry that this happened to me. So, and what the responses that I received were surprising because I would say about 90% of the responses from people from all walks of life, right? White, Black, so on and so forth, were like, I don't understand what you're talking about. How is that racism? What does she do wrong? And I said, okay. Well, so obviously, one, we don't talk about racism enough in terms of the nuances of it. But two, when we do talk about it, we talk about it in two ways. We either talk about historical context or we talk about systems, right? But what's missing from that is the ways in which the people in the systems are impacted on a daily basis, and then how people have been impacted by what has happened historically. So I said, you know what? I'm going to write about it, right? I'm not going to just write a book that says the judicial system is bad or education is flawed for Black people and brown people. No, what did I actually experience in these flawed and oppressive systems? So that's how The Black Friend was born. And that's how that came to be.
That's awesome. And I think that I read the book, and the personal experience helps so much, especially in these unnecessarily fraught times around this issue. And let's talk about why I say unnecessarily fraught. Because as probably a lot of you in this room have been hearing, whether it's on TV or if you're on Twitter like me too much, or in the news, you keep hearing the phrase critical race theory. And then you also probably keep hearing that it's, people are fighting at school boards and in state houses over banning it from our K through 12 classrooms like it's some boogeyman. So let's define our terms, because I think there's a major problem here because we're not defining our terms. So Fred, I'm going to put you on the spot right now.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think when I'm teaching these topics that they're calling critical race theory, I've always believed that I'm teaching anti-racist curriculum. What's the difference? What is critical race theory, and how does it connect or relate to anti-racist education?
Yeah, so just before I start, I'll add something. You're not just teaching anti-racism, you're teaching history, right? and that's the reality of what educators are doing. Now, the difference between anti-racism and history, though they are incorporated in the umbrella of people learning CRT, is that CRT is a very specific framework, right? CRT was created as a framework of understanding how laws, right? For it started out with students in law school, how laws and the judicial system are impacted by racism, influenced by racism, rooted in racism and white supremacy. Like literally, that's how CRT started. And CRT very much is focused on what we can do, not from a sense of like, oh, don't be racist. No, like what we can do literally to undo these laws, to combat these laws, to create structures that are more equitable within the judicial systems. And that's why they're teaching it more times than not to people in law school, or most of the time, as the earliest they teach it is at the collegiate level, like an undergrad. And that still is not something that's taught to everyone. It's an elective, and it's a very rare elective. Usually people are either going to law school or going into education, right? What people are learning in K through 12 is not critical race theory. It's not the framework of critical race theory. It has nothing, it's inherently not tied to critical race theory. Critical race theory aims to combat racism, as does anti-racism, but they are not the same thing. The reality of it is that people took the term because some person at a did a focus group or hired some marketing agency somewhere to create a narrative around critical race theory that, oh, this is what the Dems are doing. This is what they're teaching the kids. And we can use this because we can be anti-critical race theory, but we can't be anti-racism. Why? Because to be anti-racism is to be what? Pro-racism, right? Like you can't say, you literally can't say like, oh, they're teaching history, let's be anti-history. You can't be anti anything that these teachings actually are. So that's the actual core difference, is that one is a framework for changing laws, developing minds that are rooted in seeing the law through a lens of intersectionality, white supremacy, and racism. And the other things are history and frankly, just being better people, right? It's not the same.
Right. It's not the same. And I put some notes in the chat for people. Basically, if you're teaching critical race theory to kindergartners, then God bless, because you must have a really gifted and talented group of kids. They've already made it to law school level understanding and readings. And I think it's also important to emphasize that actually, even though, yes, we're not teaching critical race theory in schools, if we were, there's nothing wrong with it.
Right.
Right. And I think that's important to emphasize. And I think for me, it also feels like a new word. Like, before that, I've been called a Marxist. I've been called a socialist just because I teach at a public school and talk about, and if I tweet that I teach about civil rights, I'm called a Marxist, right? So they've decided to use this new term that sounds fancier and maybe even scarier, but it's actually not, right? Which like leads me to my next question about messaging. And it's based on a chat we were having yesterday, that the right wing has been, they're evil geniuses in their messaging. And so I'd love for you to speak a little more about that. And then how do we counter message? How do we get better at our messaging? Because a lot of teachers in this room tonight, if you're looking at the chat, might feel like their jobs are on the line or their morals. And I don't think that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, to be very transparent, as you said, the right, they are amazing at messaging, quite frankly, right? I would argue that the entire reason for the 45th president's existence was messaging. And I think oftentimes, because we are a big tent of people, we don't know how to create messaging that just aligns with everyone. Whereas on the other side, they say one thing and everyone just kind of falls in line. Oh, CRT is bad. Well, let's all agree. But I think that for educators, it really is as simple for something like CRT, as simple as saying, this is what this actually is, right? The information is accessible to what critical race theory is, who created it. It was Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, right? Who actually created this and what it was created for. Please tell me once again why you assume, who told you that I am teaching this to 7-year-olds, right? Like, so let's move that aside. What we are doing, what we are teaching here is, this is not okay to do to people, right? And you can ask a parent, do you think that it's okay to call someone the N-word? No. And every parent will say, no, I don't, right? Like 9 times out of 10, parent will say, no, I don't think that's okay. Great. That is what we are teaching, that it's not okay to do this. But we're giving context to why it's not okay, because at the end of the day, it's going to make your children better people for knowing not just that they shouldn't do something which you align with, but why they shouldn't do it. We're trying to take that load off of you. We're doing it for you, right? So I think that that's deeply important to be able to navigate that type of messaging and frankly, making it more palatable.
That's great. And I think that's really helpful in terms of how to counter message. Along those lines, how do we counter message what I'm hearing a lot when I watch these heated school board meetings and parent protests, that teachers who are teaching, really, when teachers who are teaching about anti-racism, that's what we're talking about here, we are brainwashing kids and making white kids feel guilty and shameful about being white. How do we counter message that?
I think the counter messaging for that is that everyone has privilege in their own way, right? And I oftentimes, when I'm talking to white people, whether they're older white people, younger white people, it doesn't really make a difference. I lean into my own privileges, right? I am a cisgender, heterosexual Black man, and therefore I have privileges, right? I am someone who lives within a classist system. I'm someone who lives with privilege. That is another privilege, having financial access. So oftentimes, if you break down your own privileges for a person and you're saying, okay, great, so what's your problem with you having privilege? Do you not have privilege? People have no response, none whatsoever. I'm telling everyone on here, I do this on a regular basis. When you are able to hold yourself accountable and identify that you are privileged, identify that you too have needs, that you too need space to grow, it is much easier for people to digest that they do as well. Now, frankly, you're going to encounter a ton of people who don't want to grow, right? Like, that's just the reality of it. And I think that we're all pouring from cups that are oftentimes half full. You have to decide who you're pouring the rest for. So if you are an educator and you do have students in your classes and parents are just not receptive to what you're teaching, you might have to lean more into the parents that are receptive and start identifying with them ways in which, frankly, the administration and your school is on board, because you're not going to necessarily get the parents who are not trying to hear you at all. And that's just the honest truth of it. It's like, we have to make sure our tent is solidified, sometimes more so than trying to bring more people into the tent, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And that's great advice. And I think, once again, just like what brought you to writing your book, talking about the personal to just explain your experience and make the world a better place for everyone, I really do find that having these personal conversations where you talk about yourself, it's the most effective ones, right? I want to open this up to the group in a second. I have 2 other questions. One, because I think this is really important that we really dig in a little more about the arguments that I keep hearing. The other one I keep hearing, aside from you're making white kids hate themselves, I think you helped us unpack that and figure out how to respond. There's also something going on that makes me feel like adults are really not understanding how smart young people are, and how much even a kindergartner can understand complexity. Because what I keep hearing too is, if you teach them all about the negative parts of history, they're going to hate America. And I think people are nodding their heads. I keep hearing that. And I even hear that when I tweet about some of my lessons on civil rights. Like, by you teaching about these terrible things in history, you're just making everyone hate America. What's the point? So my argument as a history teacher is we can do both.
Yeah.
Right. So what's your advice to teachers who are hearing that? I'm in New York City, so it's a lot easier for me. What's your advice for teachers who are in other places where their audience isn't as aligned with their philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, especially for educators who aren't in New York, it can be difficult, I'm sure. But constructive criticism has been at the root of what makes America special, right? America was literally founded on conflict. Like, we would not have a nation had we not wanted to be better than what we had before, right? And every single step of the way, now the same people who are quoting Dr. King was a dissenter and someone who thought that America needed to be better. So what's the difference now, right? And that's what I tell parents all the time. This isn't about hating your country. It's not about hating yourself. It's about understanding that all of us are constantly in progress. All of us are constantly growing. And what does the next iteration of America look like? An America that is finally equitable for all of us, right? And that has, again, that is what America stands for, is it not? Freedom, liberty. So if everyone doesn't have freedom and liberty, then we're not actually doing the American thing correctly, right?
I agree. And I'm glad we're recording this, because I feel like it'll be great for people to write this stuff down. And we're definitely going to summarize the discussion for you all to take back to your respective communities. So my last question goes back to just your overall impressions in your work. And I want to say, once again, thank you for all you do, because you're often on the front lines, educating people one by one who often go after you in really ugly ways, because it's hard for people to face concepts and ideas that they don't want to. But I wrote in the chat, just to remind myself, it's now my diary, tension leads to growth. I'm a firm believer in that. In order to have growth, there needs to be some conflict, right? That's what America's all about, like you were saying. So here's my question, and I'm hoping that our Q&A can end on a high note with this question, but be honest if you really don't have anything positive to say. Have you seen growth and progress that's come out of your work in the anti-racism movement and just overall work that you've seen within the movement?
Yeah, absolutely. Had I not seen any change or any growth, I probably wouldn't be sitting here right now. You know, the reality is that the work is taxing, right? The work is difficult. And as I mentioned earlier, we're all pouring from, half empty cups or drawing from half empty wells. So it's important for us to navigate where that water is going to, right? But I think that the water that I'm drawing is frankly watering a seed of change, right? A seed of change for generations to come. Now, not everyone is changing overnight, right? Like, and I never expected that to happen. I don't think anyone did. And there's regression. Like, the honest truth is, I posted a article recently that said that there's less support for Black Lives Matter now than there was before George Floyd was murdered, right? So just for context, once again, if support was at a 6 and then George Floyd was murdered and support was at like a 7, support is now down at like a 3. Right, which is sad. That's the only word that I have for it. But people are still supporting, and that has to give me hope to keep doing the work. Now, one other thing I want to say is that someone mentioned this in the chat a second ago. America says that it's always striving for a more perfect union. We hear that on a consistent and regular basis, and I always tell people, I'm always striving for a more perfect household, a more perfect family, a more perfect self. And as long as I can do that, then I have to believe that others can as well.
Thank you. So I was just scrolling through the chat, and there's so many comments. I wanted to first start with Catherine because I know she's been having a lot of experiences in her state with these CRT bans, as they call them. Can you just give us a brief description of what's happening in Tennessee and what teachers are thinking in terms of teaching in September?
Yeah, hi, I'm Catherine Vaughn. I'm an elementary art teacher from rural West Tennessee and a former New Yorker living out here. And it's been a wild ride these last couple of weeks. We noticed as we were wrapping up our school year that there was a lot of animosity growing within the community towards teachers and about what we were teaching. We received new curriculum this year from our state, so we have new textbooks, and they're a little different. They have stories from people from around the world. They're not the traditional, American tale that, the right really loves. And our parents have picked up a huge issue with it and have brought in speakers on CRT to our local Republican Party, and there's a fever pitch of coming after teachers, wanting to see our lesson plans. Our local rep was one of the people that chaired the CRT bill that is really going to limit what I'm able to teach in the next year. As an art teacher, I worked really hard this last couple of years to decolonize my syllabus and to bring in artists from all different backgrounds so that my children just aren't learning about the same 6 classically trained artists from back in the day. And I'm worried. I'm really worried that something is going to happen to teachers in my state. They've already gone after the credentials of one. And, most of my coworkers didn't know what CRT was. We had no idea. And, to go to the local Republican Party meeting, which I went to about a month ago, and to hear them talk about it was mind-boggling because I don't live in the right-wing world. I don't see this or hear this on every day. I'm currently down in Florida with my parents who do. They watch the OAN, the Fox News, and you would think that this is the greatest threat to our nation. And that all of us teachers are, indoctrinating our students with Marxism, because again, sorry, but it does sound fancy, better than communism. And it's just mind-boggling. I do a great lesson about the Negro Baseball League, and I can't teach that under the new guidelines next year.
So I'm going to jump in because here's my question, and this is what I've been preaching a lot, which is you can ban quote unquote critical race theory because, well, it doesn't even exist. And you can ban teaching from an anti-racist perspective, I guess, which I still don't know what that means. But can you ban teaching content and critical thinking? And that's where I wonder, how do you ban, can kids not read the Emancipation Proclamation anymore? Can kids not read the 13th Amendment or the 14th Amendment? Are we just going to blot out, 85 to 90% of our history? Fred, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's interesting because, I as a Black man in America, I've seen how systems are created, overlapping to destroy communities. And it's so interesting that now for the first time, I think that frankly, a lot of white people are starting to see it firsthand, right? The same type of systems that we've been dealing with forever, because, this is why they use language in many of the bills like divisive, right? What does that even mean? It doesn't mean anything. It is up to the beholder who is ultimately making the decision when it comes time to judging whether something's divisive, whether it is or not. My thought is that if teachers are going to push back and band together, it has to be around, like you said, critical thinking and then also history, right? Like the Negro Baseball League existed, right? So are you trying to just you're not teaching people or your students anything that's not real, right? I think in my book, I make a joke about white people not, being able to dance or something like that. I can see someone saying oh, that's his opinion, fine, whatever. But the Negro Leagues happened and that's a real thing. So I don't understand how they're navigating stopping you from teaching history.
Right. Like, so we can't teach about Jackie Robinson now. I mean, it's
According to the Tennessee law, if it makes white children feel bad or it makes a different race feel better, then it shouldn't be included in our classroom. So if it's saying that a group was personally persecuted because of the way they look or their orientation, then it can't be taught in my school.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's crazy. The language of the bill, if people want to go and read it, is nuts. And when I went to the meeting, they said that they purposely wrote it like that. It doesn't even include the word CRT so that it can be enforced about everything. Yeah, I asked about Japanese internment. I asked about Irish immigration and potato famine and the Holocaust, and because I'll bring survivors in and into my art room, and they're like, no. So
I want Chris Hitchcock, you bring up a really great point. And I also just, before we get into I want to bring Chris into the discussion. Can we also just like take a pause and define some more terms? Like, what came first? I start my school year with this with my students. So I would be just banned. I'm banned in the USA, basically. What came first, racism or race? Racism came first, right?
Well,
yeah.
I would actually say that race came first because
okay.
Yeah. So there's actually a really good documentary called "Exterminate All the Brutes" on HBO Max that I suggest that everyone watch. And so the concept of race was actually created by Europeans around the time that they were colonizing and settling around the world, right? So racism is a function of race. So they created race and then created racism so that once they divided people, they now have something that they can use to then create the hierarchy and caste of the systems of race that they've created. So that's.
Yeah, no, that's because I'm kind of basing, and it's similar, right? It's the same concept. I'm basing off of like Racecraft, the Field Sisters.
Yeah.
But it's connected, right? I think the whole point is that this is human-made constructs, right? I think that's what it comes down to, chicken or the egg, right? But at the end of the day, this is a human-made construct to control and keep power. So I want to bring in Chris to the discussion because you bring up some really good points. So I'd love to have you unmute and add what you were just saying earlier on.
Sorry, I didn't want you to get my kids in the background. Yeah, I was just, the language about making children feel badly about themselves or about their history or something like that, I'm unclear how teaching, because I don't understand what the people who are raising these concerns feel is the correct version of history. This seems to be focused on history, although art, obviously, I'm guessing English, a lot of things are going to be impacted. Maybe math and science gets to stay out of it, I don't know. But is this just concerned with making white children feel badly about themselves and their history? Or are we concerned at all about, if we're just teaching the rah-rah 1776 Commission version of US history or world history, what about everyone and their feelings? I'm confused. I'm confused about a lot, clearly, but that I don't know how we're supposed to not make anyone feel badly. And I mean, not that we're trying to make people feel badly, but I'm not sure how this is supposed to protect anyone's feelings, or, these laws are just worded so, it's like they're worded with the intent to chill people doing anything outside of a traditional version of in traditional 1950s or something version of the history that was taught. Sorry, my thoughts are rambling on this because I'm just very discombobulated by all of it.
Yeah, Fred, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I feel like the reason why this conversation is just so complicated is because these laws, these bills are have a specific design in mind.
Yeah. And well, I guess a few things. One, in terms of the history itself, I oftentimes think about Winston Churchill's quote when he says, history will be kind to me for I intend to write it. I think that most people who are, oppressive white people, right, have thought that history was never going to come back to bite them in their butts, right? Like that there would never be any accountability for the realities of the things that have taken place. So now that there is accountability, people are afraid of what that actually means, because a lot of people are coming to terms with the fact that they don't necessarily deserve everything that they have, right? Everything hasn't been this bootstrap story that they've been trying to sell everyone. It really is just a violent story. It's a story of some groups were more willing to perpetrate violence than others. And that's what it boils down to. So I think that now the dangers of it really are that, for the most part, these are also white men, right? If we're being really honest, these are white men for the most part. And I think that that's why the laws have been written in such a vague way that they're not just including race. They're going to also, and have included, gender, right? Sexuality, class, and any other ways in which, white patriarchal structures have been upheld. Because, in this language, like was mentioned before by Catherine, you can't teach about the Holocaust. You can't teach about indigenous populations. You can't teach about transgender community. You can't teach about suffrage, so again, it's by design. So I think that what we need to do is, if we're thinking of solutions going forward, it has to be solutions based on white patriarchal structures that are creating these laws.
Exactly. Deb from Santa Cruz, I'm not sure if you can unmute yourself, but I'd love to hear a little more about what you just wrote in the chat. That's horrifying.
Yeah, I think just the premise is that because it's a Maoist, leftist, all the ists kind of curriculum, that it's teaching children the only way to get equality is for the oppressed to overthrow, and revolution, and it's teaching revolution, and that it's a violent revolution, which, I mean, we all saw January 6th, so right, that's just all. And I live in a pretty crunchy granola kind of place, so really shocking to have. And I also don't know 100% of the folks who showed up were from our community. A couple of them I do know were, but yeah, it was just, and so we're not definitely something like, Loudoun County, but still shocking nonetheless. And our state did just pass an ethnic studies curriculum bill, which I'm super excited about. And, we're all really proud of that. And so to come from a state, that's having that mindset, and to have this fingers of just hatred coming through our community is just really shocking.
Thanks for sharing, and good luck with navigating all of that. It's so tough. Kayla, I'd love for you to share what you wrote in the chat like a minute ago about privilege.
So I teach in a predominantly white school, and we have my students of color that are often feel as if they don't fit in, and they try to have administration, teachers, somebody step up for them and tell them, listen, there's privilege here. And then the admins or the teachers will go back and they'll say, guys, you're privileged. And it becomes almost like you're attacking the white student. You're saying, well, look, you have something. And the white kid's sitting there like, well, I don't feel it. I don't see it. What do I have? And so because these teachers are not set up for success, because they don't even want to approach this topic, they don't have the tools in the tool bag to go about it and look at it as an opportunity for these kids to use their privilege for something, to use what they're given and may not know or goes unnoticed or is norm for them, to build something, to build bridges, to make changes. They don't see it like that. They see it as, I'm getting in trouble for this. I didn't do anything. And nobody really knows how to solve this. And it creates more of a divide.
Fred, you're the perfect person to help out with this.
Yeah, so if you don't mind, can I actually answer, or can I say something about something that Deb said, and then also, okay. So, I think to Deb's point, we have to realize, and I think this is the most important thing that I've realized in having a platform and writing and things of that nature, is that people on the right are phenomenal at gaslighting, right? Like even in terms of January 6th, I've read places that people are saying January 6th was in Antifa, right? They're like, oh, Black Lives Matter did January 6th. I'm like, wait, we literally watched you, to the point where like I had to like take a second and sit to myself, like, what is going on? But that's the goal. So I just wanted to comment on that, because I think it's important for everyone to take a step back at all times and understand that it is a tactic. It is a very old tactic to make you question the reality of the things that you absolutely know, right? So just stay the path in that way and build community with the people who understand the realities of what's going on around us. Now, in terms of what Kayla said, if I'm being honest, I think that there's a major failure to not just anti-racism, but anti-patriarchy, anti-classism, so on and so forth. And I think that major failure is that, like I said earlier on, we only teach these things in two ways. We teach them from a historical standpoint, and we teach it from a structural standpoint, right? But the reason why your students don't necessarily understand is because we're not teaching it from an individual standpoint to build empathy, right? We have a nation and a society globally that is founded upon and hardened by lack of critical thinking and lack of accountability, right? These are two things that people are not willing to do more times than not. So what is left? What we have left is empathy, right? The reason why most of you are on here right now, the reason why, Hulu has an entire Black Lives Matter curation is because of empathy. It's not because someone at Hulu was like, oh man, I'm white and we need to know. It's because Breonna Taylor was murdered. It's because George Floyd was murdered, and people had a moment where they felt that could have been my friend. That could have been my son. He was calling out for his mother. She was sleeping in her bed. So we need to do more work with our young people in terms of actually trying to navigate something that we all have, at least those of us who are decent people at best, is this center of empathy within us. And I think, once again, there are many books that do that. I think outside of my own book, you lean into the writings of someone like Angie Thomas, Nick Stone, right? These people who are using storytelling instead of just wagging their finger. Because kids and adults are very receptive. I've received emails from people who are in their 70s. Your book is the first thing that I've read where I understood, wow, do I do that? Is that something that I'm perpetrating? Wait, what? And I think that, again, I don't want to harp on, but we need to lean more into empathy if we're going to actually create change.
Yeah, and part of doing the work involves feeling a little uncomfortable, and I think we need to lean into that, and we need to model that for our students, and that's why the adults need to be doing the work too, because being uncomfortable is okay if your goal is to create a more equitable society with liberty and justice for all. And I do want to believe that most people want that. There's just so much fear and then manipulation going on, and great messaging from the right. And I want to bring in Monica, because I love what you wrote about we educate. I want to put this on a t-shirt actually. We educate, we do not indoctrinate. It's starting to feel very ironic, because the people who are writing these bills are accusing us of indoctrinating, but I'm starting to feel like we're navigating indoctrination laws and figuring out how to put them into our curriculum. So it's a little flipped, right? And that's why we're all confused. So Monica, I'd love if you can unmute, elaborate on your beautiful paragraph that you just wrote in the chat of like 7:37.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's one thing that is so important to me, is to let my students know that my goal and my job is not to indoctrinate them, but to have them become critical thinkers. And I really like what you said about empathy, because they have to learn how to think for themselves. They have to learn how to be media savvy, and they have to learn how to use their voices. I teach in a largely low-income Latino community that was really hit hard by the pandemic, and it really underscored the inequities that exist in our community. And I mostly taught to icons and photos and not faces. And so to try to create that empathy in that setting was really difficult. So there was a lot of kind of social emotional learning and trying to set up that inclusive classroom from the get-go. Because once you have students feel the space, your classroom is a safe space, they will open up, they will share, and they can have difficult conversations knowing that even if we disagree with what what one another is saying, that we can be okay with that. And I think that's really important. I think as a country, in a sense, we've lost our way. And when you look, at, we're history educators, right? And if you look at these two things, this idea of freedom, that was germinating at the same time that people were enslaved, that divisiveness, that kind of duality exists today, and it's just getting exacerbated because people are unwilling to be empathetic. People are unwilling to think critically, and that whole idea of kind of living in a post-truth world where people believe what they're in their emotions rather than factual information. That's why media literacy is so essential. So it is difficult. Someone wrote in the chat earlier that it's a lot of work. You put in like 10, 12 hours a day just so you can come up with a good lesson to engage your students. And some of them will do the work and some of them won't, but they will learn. And their minds, hopefully they'll be like parachutes and they'll open up at the right time. And I think that's why I think through education and through art and through forums like we're having today, these are the steps in the right direction. And thank you, because I've been on some of your Zoom sessions before, and this is imperative for us to do the work so that we can begin to heal as a nation.
Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for all you do and all the hard work you put in. I know as a teacher, I've been teaching for 19 years, and I was talking to Fred and Vicky about this the other day. Sometimes we don't see the outcome of our work because it clicks 10 years from now, 15 years from now, maybe we're not even teaching anymore. And that's just the nature of our jobs. And we just have to have that kind of faith. And then being challenged with this culture war put into our classroom just adds so much more confusion and tension into our jobs. Fred, I wanted to make sure that I'm probably missing so much in the chat too, but is there something that you just saw in the chat that you want to respond to? I know that Sid was writing something about school boards. Would love for you to jump in and tell me what you want to respond to.
Yeah. So there's a ton of great conversation happening, but I do think that what Sid just said is so deeply important, right? Sid mentioned the fact that the conservatives, they plan to take over school boards and state legislators years ago, right? And many people are against the tax on educators, so on and so forth. But their strategy and their plan is coming to fruition now, right in front of us, right? And I think that someone responded to that with another very important point, is that we have to be organized, right? We have to absolutely be organized. Last night, here in New York, and again, I don't want to jinx it, but it looks like, based on the numbers, that the Democratic nominee for mayor in New York City is likely, I'm not jinxing it, but likely going to be Eric Adams, right? And Eric Adams was someone who, when asked, he said a lot of things, but one of the things, he is very much pro-charter school. And also, during the pandemic, he was asked about Zoom classes and things of that nature. And he said, I think this is phenomenal. Teachers should, one teacher can teach 200 children on Zoom. And this is the person who's going to potentially be the mayor of New York City. And he's also a Democrat. So I asked myself, right, I was like, well, when he said those comments, and again, you can't put everything on the back of any group, but I was like, well, how many teachers came out to speak about how negative that was? In a organized way, right? Did teachers come together to stand up either against him or for another candidate? And when I looked at the endorsements, they weren't there, right? The endorsements for the opposition were not there. So I do think that the response to sit is so imperative. And this is really it. This is where organizing starts, right? In conversations, but we have to take these moments and do something systemically changeable, systemically tangible.
I agree. And it depends, you know, it's the luck of the draw where you live. In New York, we have a stronger union than other places that don't even have union protection. Someone in the chat wrote, Andrea wrote, are we supposed to ask permission before writing a lesson? And the saying's always like, ask for forgiveness later. But that's not funny if you work in a state where you're not protected by a union. So are you choosing between paying your rent, paying your mortgage, clothing your children, and going out on a limb and teaching about Jackie Robinson on a Tuesday? And that's just terrible. And Abby, you bring up the point that teachers have been through so much over the past year plus. I didn't see one of my students in person this whole year. And if I was in a state where now I'm being challenged with the content of what I'm teaching, it's just, there's already a lot of teachers leaving the field, and I can understand why this is just going to add to it. And that's really sad. Kent has been talking a lot about the work, the writing he does and the teaching he does about protest. And you brought up something in the chat a second ago that I put a pin in that I'd love for you to bring to the group.
Now, these kids come in our classroom. These conservative kids show up in our classroom. We need to, how do we respect their viewpoints as well and still maintain a safe, respectful, cooperative classroom? How do we turn this into a civil conversation?
That's a great question.
Yeah, so I mean, from my perspective, I have two answers to that. I think the first answer is, again, you frame things in a way that you're teaching real history, right? Like, nothing is divisive if it's true, right? That's just the reality of things. And then also, one could argue that we already have an educational framework that lends to making them comfortable, right? Like our entire education system, my entire, at least upbringing here in New York, within New York's education system, was one that was rooted in right-leaning conservative vantage point and history. So if anything, we're now kind of, I don't even think we're leveling the playing field. We're literally just offering a little discourse to the realities that are the education, that is the education that we've been receiving. And
to add on to that, I think you can do both. You can teach about how great not great. You can teach about the positive thing. You can teach about the positive contributions of our founding fathers. And you can also talk about the fact that a lot of them had enslaved people, that they profited and made their wealth off of chattel slavery. And I think our kids can handle it. I think they can handle it. And the best compliment I ever got was from a student who said that she walked out of my class both loving America and hating it at the same time. And I was like, my job's well done. And I think it's so important in this complex world that we've always lived in, that we help kids understand that things aren't black or white, no pun intended, right? There's so many different levels and layers, and our students, young people understand that. Like, have you been on TikTok? I'm kidding, kind of, but like kids get complexity. I think we're really selling them short when we say that like a kid who comes from a conservative background isn't going to be able to be, that you can't do both with them. I don't know. What do you think? I'd love to hear your response, Kent.
It's hard. I think it's one of the harder things we do. I think, to be honest, when we don't do it very well. I think we need to be more cognizant of our own prejudices that we bring into the classroom, and work really, really hard to honor all kids. And it's difficult. I mean, it's just a challenge, particularly when many kids are expounding viewpoints that are injurious or harmful to others. But they're still just children. They are children yet. We need to remember that.
That's so powerful. Just, they're still children. Even when they're 17, 18, they look older than me because I'm kind of short. You can't tell as I'm sitting here. I'm 5'1". Can you believe it? And I sometimes have to remind myself that 17-year-old boy who's 6 feet tall is still a child. And I need to be patient and give them the tools to understand things. And I think make sure that we keep reminding ourselves that we're not indoctrinating when we're educating, right? Fred, like, can you kind of decouple that? Because I feel like there's this confusion over the difference between educating and indoctrinating. And I want to make sure teachers leave this discussion not feeling further gaslit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to be quite frank, again, I lean into the concept of history and the realities of the things that have taken place and are actively taking place right in front of us. You know, using, for example, 1619 and 1776, they are not rivals. They both literally exist, right? Both things are true, right? 1619 has relevance, as does 1776. The issue right now is that we're only teaching about one of them for the most part. We are teaching that, you know, this one date is when this country was founded, and this is the glorious birthday of this country, and we are ignoring the other one. I think that we do an actual job of indoctrination by ignoring 1619 as an example, right? Educating is giving students and people in general the full picture of what has taken place so that people can decide for themselves who and what they want to be. Because quite frankly, when I came out of high school and elementary school and middle school, I didn't have the full picture. Even as a Black person, I had a quarter of the picture of my entire life and who I am and why I am, right? And when I learned more, I didn't love America any less. I actually kind of loved America more in that I wanted to make America grow. I wanted to make America better. And I think that that's the thing that people have to realize, you know, as an example from, again, I am an African American. This is my home, as it is the home of everyone who is espousing negative things about me. My aim is to make it better. Their aim is to keep it the same. So I do think that oftentimes the indoctrination leans into me not knowing things versus having a full picture of what I should know and what I deserve to know.
Thank you so much. I love the way you phrase that. And also, if kids can see themselves in the American story, then they have a more invested interest in the future of America. And I think that we're forgetting that you can tell students, teach about chattel slavery and the horrors of it, but you can also highlight people in history that were victims of enslavement, but also took brave action in the face of terror. And there's ways to do that to make students feel empowered and also angry at the same time, because I think we keep saying this, but complexity, kids can handle complexity and they want it. And people are agreeing with me that kids often get really angry when they learn about something like the Tulsa Massacre when they're 17, or even worse, on TikTok, because, you know, you can ban what you teach in schools, but you can't take apps off kids' phones, right? They know how to Google.
If I can add a point, right? I think this generation, especially because of the advent of certain communication tools, they are far more educationally liberated than we've ever seen before, right? And that educational liberation has liberated them in terms of gender binaries, racial identities, and just identities across the board, right? We are actually stifling them by not opening up the world for them. By not saying, here is the full lay of the land, we are actually, we're doing them a disservice, because if they don't get it from us, they're going to get it from someone else. So that makes us lesser educators also. We are lesser educators, lesser parents, lesser uncles and aunts and older cousins and all these different things by not being the people who curate and help and hold their hand towards the information that they're frankly going to get regardless at this point.
Thank you. That's so important to emphasize. And I see a lot of people in the chat, and I know we're running out of time, but I want to get to some more points really quickly. There's a lot of talk in the chat that, yeah, actually, you're right. Gen Z can handle this. It's their parents. And Sarah, I'd love for you to share what you just wrote in the chat a minute ago. Sarah Jennings.
Yeah, so I used to teach middle school civics and English, and I've been a Sunday school director for 12 years, and I live at a school, a boarding day school, an independent school, and my kids go to public school, so it's a big mishmash of experiences. But I just, like, every conversation I'm in with whichever population of educators, we're all kind of agreeing that, it's so heavy for kids these days. They have so many feelings. It's so hard. Life is so scary. And I feel that way about my 3 teenagers, 14, 18, 19. And yet it's like, we can't protect them from truth. And I think maybe the radical anti-CRT people are just coming from this fear. I mean, not to excuse the behavior, but coming from this fear of, wow, these kids just know so much and they have so many scary things to tackle, and let's just not tell them about it. So I don't know. I think I'm seeing with all different age groups, you can't hide. And I guess, like, Fred, I loved your book so much. My friend in California who I used to teach with sent a picture of it, and he said, Sarah, I could have written this book. And I said, Ronaldo, I was thinking of you when I read it. And it's just, I think we just have to stop being so frightened, because the kids are just taking off. They just, like someone wrote in here, they have everything in their pocket on their phone. They have so much access to so much information. And so as adults, we just have to step in. The other thing another point I was thinking about is that, and somebody might have said this, how do teachers find the time to go and participate in these really hard combative conversations where, the opponents of true history are in there making a lot of racket and getting their word out with their propaganda. And I'm surrounded by educators who aren't participating in these conversations. Like, it's heartbreaking. They're just like, I don't have time. I'm just trying to take care of my 25 kids or my 35 kids. Like, I don't know. A lot of thoughts, like Chris was saying earlier. It's very overwhelming.
It's overwhelming. And I think, I know we need to wrap up soon. I want to be cognizant of people's time, but I think this leads me to saying that I think we need to have a part 2 of this. And I think that you've read the book, Sarah, but he has a really great glossary and definition of terms. It's so helpful. And I think what we're going to do, we discussed, is create some kind of toolkit for us, that kind of perhaps a one sheet of sorts that we can use for messaging. And perhaps we can have another discussion this summer speaking to what Sarah's asking. But I'd love for Fred to jump in and respond to Sarah. And then I know there's a lot more people with questions in the chat, which makes me think that we need to have a part 2, because this is sadly so much to unpack. Mm-hmm. But crucial. So Fred, I'd love for you to respond to Sarah and then just some concluding remarks on everything.
Yeah, well, I'd love to do a part 2. This has been not only phenomenally interesting and engaging, it's been healing in many ways, right? I think that we have to realize that when we get in spaces with people who are trying to make progress with us, that does something good for our souls. And that's just the honest truth. Now, to the point you made, Sarah, and thank you also for reading the book, and thank you for everyone who has read the book. I hope that you stay engaged for the next 2 books, I suppose. I think that people have to realize that, for lack of a better term, the kids are all right. Right? The kids are all right. I was thinking about this. Someone said this to me recently, like, well, I don't want my child, and this is a friend of mine, right? And this is just a white friend that I don't want my child learning about all this LGB, this and that, a third, X, Y. How would they handle it? I said, you and I sat in middle school and watched the Twin Towers fall. We literally sat there and watched people destroy the Twin Towers. As kids in New York City, living on the Hudson River, we watched that happen live. You don't think that your children can handle learning about other people's truths of who they are and how they show up in the world and what their identities entail? Are you serious? You're not protecting them, you're protecting yourself. You're not ready for certain things, and that's the reality. And I think that's what a lot of people need to navigate. This isn't about children. This is about adults, right? People's attacks on anti-racism, anti-classism, anti-patriarchy, anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia is not about the young people. It is about the adults who are trying to indoctrinate young people in the ignorances that they were indoctrinated in, right? And when we realize that, that helps us not only forge deeper community, but also act strategically in terms of navigating the people that we're dealing with. So, you know, that's my response. That was my response to that person, is that, again, the kids are all right. We've seen plenty before. We've seen 9/11, Vietnam. We've seen the war in Afghanistan. We've seen the war on drugs. We've seen it all, right? We've seen it all. I think that we can handle identities.
That's so beautiful and powerful. And as Kent said in the chat, it's great this is being recorded, because I think that it might assuage some fears that non-educators are having about us and our intentions here. And I'd like to think that if we can get past this and find a way to teach young people what they deserve to learn about, maybe, just maybe, they can hold their parents' hands and walk them through some of these concepts and make them realize it's actually not that scary. And in fact, it's a beautiful thing to accept and celebrate what we say are differences, or, you know, different ideologies. And we can all come together in a way that, you know, there's always going to be naysayers, but I'm hoping that if we can get past this backlash, we can move forward where we get back to this kind of, just as like the Black Lives Matter movement last summer was so beautiful because it was intergenerational and it was multicultural, as you know, it's like every single person was represented, at least what I saw in the streets. And it was, I love that it was intergenerational. And I hope that we can move forward where if we can help young people understand this stuff, they can explain it to their parents in a way that we can all come together in a more powerful way. So thank you so much, Fred. Concluding remarks from Fred, and then I'll toss it back to Vicki and we can wrap up, and she'll tell you what we do with this recording and what resources we're going to create. So Fred, I'd love to just get just concluding remarks from you. It can be brief, and then we can let everyone go enjoy the rest of the day.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you again to everyone who has joined and everyone who's going to watch this going forward. You know, the work is not easy. The work is not meant to be easy, right? And I think that's important for us to all understand. But the work is important, and there's a return on investment for progress, right? We have progressed historically since this nation was founded. We have continued to progress, right? And if we keep doing that, who knows what will become? And that's what we're in right now, a moment of progress, a moment of evolution. So, you know, if you feel weary, keep going. Take time for rest, but keep going, because we are right there, quite frankly. We are like literally right there.
Thank you so much, Fred. And make sure you look at the chat. We'll also save it. There's just so much amazing feedback from the discussion tonight. And I think I might have been dreaming it, but did you say that you'd be happy and willing to do a part 2 perhaps this summer?
Yeah, I'd love to do a part 2. I'm hoping that everyone joins, and you know, for everyone who's an educator on here, when you do join, I hope that you're gonna have to bring a drink or something like that to relax a little bit, because I know it's been a long school year, and I just want to say a very specific shout out to Kelly Snyder. Thank you for being here, and I love what you just said. That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Amazing. And yeah, I see so many familiar faces and new faces here. And I'm hoping that when we do this again, you can all join, and we'll have other programming this summer as well. But this is really important conversation. And it's important because we want to make sure we can be there for the young people that we teach and care about. So thank you, Fred. Sorry to put you on the spot, but you already said it. And I'm so grateful for you and all the work you do. He's on the front lines every day, whether it's having conversations with people in real life and also online. He's doing the work, and I really appreciate all you do. I think we might have, there's Vicki. Vicki, you moved slots. So I'm going to toss it back to Vicky. And I want to just say once again, thank you so much. Put your handles in the chat and I'll follow you and we can continue this conversation online. And I love the ideas of us coming together too. So I think our goal once we work with Fred in a part 2 is coming up with a strategy, whether it's for Catherine or teachers in places where it's a little less challenging. We all are going to have to navigate this. And I love the idea of working together.